we actually use frustration as more of an observable thing rather than as a feeling. If something frustrates your progress when it actually gets in the way between you and what you want versus having something bad happen and then get frustrated. So a source of frustration then we would actually assign to an observable event. That way we can actually do something about it. What frustrates your progress in that regard? So what do you do? What do you do when you want to change yourself? Well, you might make a reasonable guess that you do the thing that causes the changing. Imagine that. In reality, the answer looks closer to something like this. You resolve what gets between you and purposeful action. Chances are you already know what to do. You already know what to do. We just have all this stuff in the way between the thing that we want to do and actually doing the thing. And at TCAN, we call this the intention intervention gap. So what we prioritize more here, the things getting in the way of the stuff you kind of already know how to do. We resolve what gets in between you and taking purposeful action of the thing that gets you closer to your overarching objective. So earlier, again, we defined the thing between you and doing what it takes to get what you want as frustration. So when it comes to frustration and resolving it, facts facilitate function. If you have observables, it makes it easier to do something about the situation. It helps you do stuff, except have nice handwriting. We'll get better as we go. So in lay language or normal language, whatever you want to, conversation, colloquialisms, whatever, frustration describes a feeling. I'm so frustrated. He really frustrates me, et cetera, rather than an event in the observable world. In that regard, frustration as a feeling confuses your progress and handicaps what progress you can make. If somebody feels frustrated, well, then what can you really do about this feeling? What can you really do about it? You can complain about it. You can get frustrated about your own frustration and get yourself into double trouble, okay? People have a tough time describing frustration, but saying you feel frustrated just tells us something generic. I have a problem. Well, congratulations. It gets you zero explanatory value or utility. So people have a tough time describing frustration, often talking in circles, using vague synonyms or other nebulous language. And then the plan to get around frustration amounts to some variation of, well, I'll just have to get over it. What do they want to get over? They want to get over this feeling of frustration. They want to get over this frustrated feeling. And where does this lead? Where does this lead? It leads to them leaning on their so-called generalized repertoire of behaviors to avoid bad stuff. What do people do when they try and get over stuff? You might know this as doing things that make us feel better, or wind down, or to help me relax, or to fill a void, etc., etc. What do people do to get over negative feelings? Really? They eat, drink, smoke, binge watch, complain, shop, act out, complain. So some learn healthier alternatives, okay? Healthy alternatives to getting over negative feelings, which amount to things like meditation, yoga, exercise, walking, music, coloring, hot baths, etc. This kind of presents itself in an interesting way though, because in and of itself, these healthy alternatives, healthy or harmful, people still deal with feelings by distracting themselves from them. So whether you binge watch,
the hell did I get hooked on this damn show?
Or do drugs or drink or complain or exercise or do yoga or color, they still both act as ways to distract yourself. Some, again, have side benefits. They still act as distraction. They do these things on purpose, but they miss the part of doing it with purpose. So they know that when they get this negative feeling, they do this thing until the negative feeling goes away. Great. But what happens when you come down from that high? The thing that caused the problem still exists. In some situations, just kind of holding the fort until it goes away helps, because some problems do solve themselves. When it comes to chronic stuff, though, you'll chronically upset yourself, which means you'll just end up chronically meditating, chronically exercising, chronically coloring, chronically smoking, chronically whatever distraction apparatus you use. So you can have the world's greatest self-regulation, managing any negative feeling you observe, and the benefits, however substantial, end there. So sure, the bad feeling goes away. You can only wait for it to come back, and it does come back. So do you feel better for a bit? Sure. Do you get better? Questionable. That depends on the context. For chronic frustrations, no. Left hooks that life gives you? Absolutely. If you get the Rona and it knocks you on your butt for 5 days, you just kind of have to deal with it for 5 days, in which case healthier alternatives to smoking, drinking, watching, whatever, arguing with like that, the healthier alternatives will end up netting you benefits. For other things like avoiding paying bills or relationship issues or chronically overeating, things that we want to avoid bad feelings by doing other stuff, those things will still exist when we come back from feeling feeling better, okay? So by framing frustration as a feeling in and of itself, at best, you can do something benign to interfere with doing something dumb. Now, pretty good, all things considered. I would say probably priority one for resolving any problem amounts to, well, what can I do to make this worse? And then try alternatives while I can create some time for a rational solution process, okay? So by framing frustration as a feeling, okay, a rather ambiguous private event, right? My definition of frustration, yes, excellent definition. An ambiguous private event. You know it when you see it, I guess. You recognize it when you see it, differing from you know it. So a rather ambiguous private event, even vague in observation to us. And therein lies the crux of this whole facts facilitate function, and why focusing on the feeling ends up distracting you more than it helps resolve the problem. So considering this, what chance do you have at resolving the feeling if you have problems describing it in factual terms so that you can resolve it? Okay, or enlisting others to help resolve it. Also a great idea. If you say, hey mom, I just, well then like, what can mom do? Mom at best can help distract you, okay? Or your best friend or whomever. So we really only have strange metaphors and wispy vagaries, like I feel it in my gut. Well, do you? Or you just said that to try and make some noise with your face and continue the conversation. We make a lot of face noise. It means very little. So we only have strange metaphors and wispy vagaries to work with, making it even more frustrating. So let's get to distortions a little bit. One of the main culprits in making it difficult for us to stick to the facts, because if we stick to the facts, then we have an easier time of observing and describing what leads to our frustration rather than just obsessing over the frustration in its own right. So distortions, this creates the straight and narrow path to what we at TKN call double trouble. Double trouble. In other words, we already got some shit to deal with, and then we observe the situation, we describe it by shaking our fists and saying silly stuff, making it even worse for ourselves. We make it even more difficult to tolerate. So we get frustrated, and then we get frustrated about our frustration, and we get into double trouble. Some people might feel strange hearing this, we get emotionally disturbed. We actually get disturbed. And when I use emotional disturbance, I mean that the state of our body starts to affect our decision making. We tend to do sillier stuff when we get worked up. And by distorting reality, which we'll get to in a second, we increase the probability of getting worked up about stuff, therefore increasing the probability of doing silly things, leading to more frustrations. So the stimulus of the frustration, the response, we get ourselves into double trouble, and the frustration as the stimulus, the response, we get into double trouble, and as the outcome, we have more frustrations. And what does that lead to? Extra frustrating stimuli to deal with. And around the merry-go-round we go. So you get into double trouble when your frustration starts to frustrate you. You notice you start tolerating the fact that you've had to tolerate something frustrating. Some fancy cognitive psychological people might call this metacognition or whatever. Basically, you start complaining about the fact that you complained about something, and it compounds. Or worry that you worry, or get mad that you got mad, okay? So you notice you start tolerating that you've had to tolerate something, and this adds rocket fuel to the frustration, punishment, stimulus transformation. So in the previous discussions, we learned that a frustrating stimulus, right, something observable that gets in the way of what we want, if we have to deal with that crap long enough, I'm not touching you, right? You deal with that long enough, our behavior changes. It goes from a frustrating stimulus to a punishing stimulus. And we define punishment in a rather technical way. You want to get away from it. You can only take it so long. Somebody's sticking their finger in your eye and you go, dude, get the hell away from me. You little bugger. At that point, that frustration turned into punishment because you actively tried to get away from it or get it away from you. So people use punishment as a verb, and technically speaking, I consider that wrong because punishment exists as an outcome rather than a cause. You only get punished if you observe the person trying to get away from the thing. Whips and chains punish some people and reward others. So the idea of punishment as a verb really comes down to the context and the history of the person. And so you get punished as an outcome. You can only know if you got punished by observing the person trying to get away from it, or yourself, okay? So you start feeling frustrated because you feel frustrated. And then soon enough, you catch a case of Dr. Albert Ellis's infamous, I can't stand it itis. You go, shit, I can't stand it anymore, and you give up.
I can't do this no more.
I can't stand this frustration anymore. And you get away from it, you give up, you do something silly. It's whatever equivalent, okay? You start sensitizing yourself. So this has a time component or an endurance component. The more tolerance skill you have, the longer it takes to transition from frustration to punishment. You want that to take as long as possible because it gives you some time to resolve a problem before you act silly, okay? When you start distorting reality, which we'll get to in a second, you get the I can't stand it, I can't stand this anymore, this sucks, why bother, how horrible, terrible, awful. You shrink how much tolerance you have that making something frustrating get punishing faster and faster. In other words, the more you whine about something, the worse it gets. For real. I use the term whine loosely, right? If you start describing things in a dramatic way, horrible, terrible, awful, always, never, you start demanding this really shouldn't be this way. It has to do, I have to get better results than this. You start downing, what an a-hole, I'm so stupid. Then you start despairing, why bother? I can't stand anything. So all these language patterns work together to take something frustrating and turn it into something punishing faster and faster versus just sticking to the facts. Is this horrible, terrible, awful? No, they messed up your order. Okay. Now, what does that make the tidal wave in a foreign island wiping out half the population? If you had a horrible meal, what does that make that? And so this level of language ends up sensitizing you to frustration because we know of horrific events. We know of horrific events. And when you say that meal was horrible, what do? You form that relationship. Good grief. And so sticking to the facts, like, did I have a horrible time at that restaurant? No. They took 5 more minutes than I wanted. Now you can see that I had an absolutely horrible, terrible, awful time and I'll never go back there again. Why bother? 2, they took longer than I wanted. I have a low chance of going back, but I might try it again with a different waiter. And so by sticking to the facts, you have a better chance of tolerating frustration than when you start distorting the facts. Hopefully that follows. So you can observe I can't stand it-itis coming on when people start verbalizing internal and or external, right? You start talking to yourself as well as you talk to anyone else, these internal and external distortions. So we talked about it a little bit. So first we can define distortion really as biased language. Fair, like plain and simple, biased language. And this biased language, you can do it privately or publicly. I use the terms private and public as a way to delineate, well, did I talk to myself, what some people would call thinking, or did I talk to somebody else? Did I have a private conversation with myself or did I say it out loud? So this sort of language can happen internal or external. So biased language, public or private, that sensitizes you to something frustrating. Almost always, I'll even say always, to dramatize for the effect that it sensitizes you to something frustrating. So distorted language comes in 4 major flavors. It comes in 4 major flavors. Demands, the big kahuna. I consider this the main course where all the other distortions end up deriving. This depends actually on culture because different cultures use language in different ways. So when I call it derivative, I actually consider it derivative for a Western English speaker specifically because I have only studied that and have my expertise within the English language only. So keep that, take that into consideration because actually like in places like Czechoslovakia, they actually have separate order of operations when it comes to distorting, which I actually find kind of neat, okay? So you have demands. We'll get into these in a second. Drama, downing, and despairing. I hinted at these. Lots of D's, helps keep it easier to manage. So when we get frustrated and start frustrating ourselves about the frustration, we tend to start by demanding, or we have an implicit demand, which some people would call a belief, all right? Really just means a rule that you follow, okay? So this happens when we state a mere preference as a necessity. This means to use I'll just use a generic example first. It means that you use the words should, must, have to, need, etc., etc. How many times have you heard or used words like this and you actually needed this thing, or you really had to do it, or it must be this way? Seldom. I would argue from a Stoic standpoint to dramatize for effect, never, because worst case you die and we all die anyway, if you want to get that gnarly with a more Stoic standpoint. So really these demands, you should have really done that. Really? Well, if I should have, then I would have. So did I have to? No. I really need this. Well, what happens if you have something else? Do your brains explode onto the side of the wall? No. Well, then did you need it? No. I really have to. So what does this really really do? This demandingness gives us an implicit or explicit or else. This or else. You really should do this or else. I really have to do or else. It really must be this way or else. Now, what does that or else do? That or else creates a dichotomous black and white situation. It means I either get my way or I give myself permission to act like a dipshit. It means I get my way or I give myself permission to act silly. That language increases the probability of this happening and why it sensitizes us to frustration. They really should have done this faster or else I'll start complaining. This is a horrible restaurant. They're idiot freaking waiters. Why bother even paying? Demands, drama, downing, despairing. Then you give up and leave, okay? You upset yourself over it by using this very frank language pattern, okay? Why does this have to be so hard? Why me? Okay, then you start dramatizing. Typically it starts with demanding. So we walk around with demands already. So sometimes it jumps right to the dramatizing if you look at the language. But again, should, must, have to, need, people throw that around like Prozac and people throw Prozac around like candy. So it ends up coming out wherever you look to dramatizing. Then we start dramatizing. Extreme black and white descriptions of themselves, others, or the situation. This is horrible, terrible, awful, the worst. Like I'm the worst mom. Really? Compared to what data set? Where do you have to like, oh my goodness, terrible, terror, horrible, horror, awful, awe-filled, like a demon came out of the ground, an awful sight? Can you get any more dramatic than saying a demon came out of the ground and tried to suck my brain out of my nose? No, they just forgot the cheese on your sandwich. And by relating these two things, you really go on the straight and narrow to upset yourself. And then what happens? Man, this never works. This always screws up. Everything sucks. Nothing works. Drama, drama, drama. Does everything really suck? Does nothing ever work? This never works. Wow. How far off does this deviate from the facts? And by deviating from the facts in this way, how easy does it make it to give yourself permission to act like a silly goose? These diets never work. They always fail. It's horrible eating like this. Why bother? Dr. Kashey is a stupid dummy head. I can't stand this anymore. Why bother with it? Okay. Again, we start downing. So we start with the demand, should, must, have to, need. We move the drama. Horrible, terrible, awful, always, never, nothing, everything, goodness. And then we start downing. If everything fails, well then shoot, we start labeling others or the situation or ourselves in a negative way or in a positive way. The distortions go either way in terms of getting ourselves upset. You can put somebody or yourself on a pedestal and that would just as well increase the probability of upsetting yourself. People call that betrayal, okay? So I'm such a failure. They're too stupid to help me. This car is a real piece of... I know what poop looks like. I spent a long time in college. And if your poop looks like a car, then you should go to the doctor. You laugh, but people talk like this and then spend most of their lives stressed out and miserable. And ideally, if we can talk about it in this way, we can start catching ourselves when we use this sort of language and then actually laugh at ourselves when we do it. Because is this thing really a piece of shit? Well, if your looks like that, then go to the gastroenterologist. And if it looks like then you probably used the wrong tool and a little bit of education might help you. Now that we have that covered, once you realize that you try and use a piece of poop as a knife, okay, and it failed and you upset yourself over it, what happens? You start despairing. You go on to the despairing stages. I call this a stage in quotes. These can happen in any order or combination. I just see this as the most convenient way to list them because when I studied language, it tends to occur in this order most often, okay? We start despairing. Indications of absurdity, futility, indignation, okay? Like you get mad because life is unfair. Impending defeat, and so forth. You get lots of this, lots of twos. That ends up getting jammed in there a lot. Too hard, too stressful, too much to deal with, too expensive, too poor, too stressful, too much time. Why me? Why do I have to deal with this crap? Why bother? I can't stand it anymore. I can't stand it-itis. And what's the point? Why bother? I lump this all into despairing, right? Absurdity, futility, indignation, impending defeat. Like, why should I even do this anymore? It's just gonna fail feel like it does every other time because I'm an idiot. See how this all loops in on itself? So why do we go into such detail here about sensitizing ourselves to frustration? Well, to answer the question about what frustrates our progress, it pays to know that a vast majority of the time we frustrate our own progress by sensitizing ourselves to the frustrating stimuli we actually want to resolve. Because if we stuck to the facts, described the situation as it existed, took some notes, approached it in a rational way, we have a pretty high probability of resolving the situation, keeping a level head, and getting on with our damn lives. And instead, this can't be like this. It really should be another way, and it never works. And why bother? Because I'm an idiot. I'd upset myself too, describing things that way with the sort of relationships we have with these words. It's horrible. Yeah, like think of the things that actually embody horror. And so to call something horrible, you relate it to those things. Good grief, or bad grief as it were. You sensitize yourself. I sensitize myself when I start taking a situation and I describe it with this distorted language. So the real progress, the change, from feeling better to getting better comes from substantiating your frustration, where once you saw it as a feeling and substantiating as a concrete event in the publicly observable world. Something frustrated you because it got in your way from something you wanted. And if you can describe it in a way that fits the facts, you give yourself a fighting chance. The who, the what, the where, the when, and the how if you can. You know what people get stuck with? The why. Why did this happen? Why does it happen to me? What? Like the cult of why must die. Like if you walk into a dark room, do you explain how electricity works? Or do you flip the damn light switch? Why is it so? Just flip the light switch. Good grief. So finding what causes a problem works as a really great way to distract yourself from resolving it, because what causes a problem happened a long time ago, and that probably differs from what maintains the problem right now. Like, to talk about a sensitive topic, a lot of this goes into the context of things like trauma, however you define that. Because something happened in my past, as a small child perhaps, or a young adult, and now I let 11-year-old me make decisions for 41-year-old me. So something then caused an issue, sure. Now what maintained that issue? Something different. And so finding the cause sends people on wild goose chases that just end up making it so they hate their lives more and still have nothing to do about the problem. So if you get frustrated, it happened because of something in the last probably 30 minutes. And we just tell ourselves the story that it had to do with 30 years ago. And that makes it real hard to resolve the problem right now. Okay, real tough. So if we find something that affected us in the real world right now, describing it with as literal language as we can manage, then we give ourselves a fighting chance. If it exists out in the environment, then you can manipulate the environment or how you interact with the environment. Then it follows you can have a direct effect on the stimulus itself. You can build your tolerance to it. You can strategize around it. You can resolve it outright, okay? And we exist to help deal with those sorts of things. We already know to eat less, move more, sleep, eat our vegetables, whatever the hell, trainers try and shove down your throat every day. All that other crap getting in the way decreases, lowers the probability of doing it. The frustrations in our lives. And so we care more that you take your foot off the brake, that you actually put the car in drive. Otherwise you rev the engine and park. We call that anxiety and burnout. People revving the engine and park. So instead of feeling better, which bad feelings only last so long, good feelings only last so long as well, you send yourself in a real circle of hell that way. Okay. Instead of feeling better, you get better. In this context, we can get trapped in our own frustrations and, work ourselves up into tizzies, and a lot of our own bullshit kind of solves itself. And for some people, it gets worse and worse and worse and worse until it looks like you only got one solution left. And so I take things as a scientist to an extreme on purpose, because I know if I can apply it to the most extreme thing, then it'll work itself down pretty well, versus just some things that work some of the time with no. I go right to the most violently ugly result possible, find positive results there, and know for sure that it'll work backwards. In a sillier conversation, I'd call it the frustration aversion paradox. By avoiding things that frustrate you, you create more frustrations for yourself to avoid until life in its entirety as you know it gets frustrating. And this takes decades or not, but really we can just say that by avoiding problems, you create more problems to avoid.